My father died on a Monday, and by Wednesday I was sleeping in my car. Not because I had nowhere to go, because the place I thought I had was no longer mine. The key that I had carried for 3 years, the brass key on the ring with the little blue tag I had put there so I could find it quickly in my bag. That key did not work when I put it in the lock of the house I had lived in as a wife. I had come from the cemetery. I was still wearing the black dress with the small buttons at the collar that I had bought specifically for the funeral because I did not own anything appropriate and because my father would have noticed if I had shown up in something that was not appropriate, and I wanted to honor his noticing even though he was no longer there to do it. The cemetery was 40 minutes from the house. I had driven those 40 minutes on autopilot in the way of someone whose body knows a route well enough to travel it without the full participation of the mind. My mind had been elsewhere. My mind had been in the last 6 months, which I had spent visiting my father in the specific way of someone who understood that each visit might be the last without wanting to look at that understanding directly. He had been patient about dying. That was the word I kept coming back to, patient. He had handled the process of leaving with the same quality he had brought to everything, without drama, without demanding that it be different from what it was, attending to what needed attending to and leaving the rest. The boxes on the porch told me everything before the door told me the rest. They were brown cardboard boxes, the standard size, the kind you buy at a packing store. My clothes were in 2 of them. My books were in another. The photograph from my parents' 20th anniversary was in the 4th box, wrapped in a dish towel, which I found later and which was the specific detail that stayed with me longest. That someone had taken the time to wrap that photograph in a dish towel but had not taken the time to tell me what was happening. Julian opened the door before I knocked. He looked the way he always looked, which was controlled and contained and presenting nothing that had not been curated. He stepped back and Evelyn was there behind him in the living room of the house I had lived in for 3 years, wearing a blazer, holding a document in both hands like an offering or a verdict. She said the company was gone. She said my father had left me nothing. She said the Whitmore family could not afford to carry a liability and that Julian needed to think about his future with someone who could contribute to it rather than diminish it. She said all of this with the specific warmth of a woman delivering a diagnosis she has prepared for and that she believes is for your own good. Julian looked at the floor. I took the document. I did not read it. I picked up the box with the anniversary photograph and I carried it to my car. I put it in the back seat. I got in the driver's seat. I sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and I looked at the house through the windshield. Then I drove to the address my father's assistant had given me that morning when she called to confirm the appointment I did not remember making. My name is Audrey Bennett. I am 25 years old. I organize events for a living. I am good at logistics and I am good at reading rooms and I am good at understanding what is supposed to happen and when. What had just happened was not what was supposed to happen. What happened next was the thing that made everything after it possible. David Vance's office was on the 4th floor of a building near the courthouse. It was a Wednesday afternoon and the building was quiet in the way of places where serious work is done and the seriousness has settled into the architecture. The receptionist said he was expecting me. She said it gently, the way people say things gently to people who have recently been to a funeral. He stood when I came in. He was 32 years old and he had been my father's attorney for years, and he had a quality I noticed immediately, which was that he was looking at me rather than at the version of me he expected to see. He saw the black dress and the box I was still carrying. I had not thought to leave it in the car, and he said sit down, and he meant it as a kind thing rather than a directive. He brought water. He sat across from me. He said, I have some things to tell you about your father and I need you to hear everything before you say anything. I said okay. He said my father had known the direction of things for 8 months. He said my father had been watching Julian and Evelyn for longer than that and had reached conclusions about what they were. He said my father was a precise man who made decisions based on what he actually saw rather than what he hoped, and what he had seen had produced certain decisions. He said the company had not failed. He said the company had been sold. He said a global development firm had offered $40 million and my father had accepted the offer and the sale had closed 6 weeks before he died. He said the money was not gone. He said the money was in a trust, a private foundation in the name of Arthur Bennett, my grandfather, my father's father, named for him specifically. The foundation had conditions. The conditions were 2. The trust released to me fully if I filed for divorce. The trust released to me fully if Julian's infidelity was documented and proven. Either condition was sufficient. Neither condition could be waived. The structure was complete and had been completed with the specific deliberateness of a man who understood that he was not going to be there to finish the job himself. David said the divorce proceedings had been initiated this afternoon by Julian's attorney. He said that meant the first condition was already in motion. He said we were going to let the motion proceed. He said we were going to proceed quietly and correctly and at the right pace. He said my father had told him one more thing. He said if everything went as planned to tell Audrey that he had always known she was capable of it. I sat with that for a long time. The office was quiet. The water glass was cold in my hand. Then I said, let's build it correctly. I moved into a small apartment on the east side of Charlotte. I had enough saved from the previous 2 years of work to cover 6 months if I was careful, and I was always careful. That was one of the things I was good at. The apartment was on the second floor of a building with a parking lot that smelled like asphalt in the mornings and that had good light in the afternoons from the west-facing windows. I continued working. This was not discipline exactly. This was necessity and also sanity. I organized a technology awards dinner. I organized a fundraiser for a children's medical center. I organized a holiday party for a regional bank. I showed up on time. I did the work completely. I went home to the east side apartment and I made simple dinners and I sat at the small kitchen table and I wrote in the notebook I had been keeping since I was 12 years old. My father had given me the first notebook. He had said write down what you actually notice, not what you think you are supposed to notice, and the real thinking lives in the difference between those two things. I had been following that instruction for 13 years. The notebook from those months is the one I look at now when I need to remember what those months actually felt like, which is not dramatic but is very specific. The handwriting changes. The entries from the first 2 weeks after he died are pressed harder into the page. Julian's phone had a cloud backup. He had given me the account password 2 years earlier for a streaming service and had not changed it since. I am an events coordinator. I understand systems and shared credentials and the vulnerabilities of both. I accessed the backup on a Tuesday evening 6 weeks after moving into the apartment. I understood immediately what I was looking at. The messages were between Julian and a woman I had known for 6 years. We had been close in the specific way of two people who had been present for the significant events of each other's lives. I had been present at her mother's funeral. She had been present at my wedding. The messages between her and Julian went back 14 months. They were explicit about the relationship. They were more revealing about the plans. They had mapped out the properties. They had discussed what remained of my father's assets, which they believed were minimal. They had a timeline for the divorce and a plan for what Julian expected to acquire. They had been thorough and detailed and they had not been careful because they had been certain I had nothing. Certainty makes people careless. Careless people leave records. I documented everything carefully. I sent it to David the following morning. He called at noon and said this is exactly what we needed. I said I know. He said are you okay? I said I will be. He said that's the right answer. Evelyn Whitmore's financial situation was the mechanism. David found it in the discovery process required by the divorce proceedings. She had been living at a scale that her actual resources had not supported for approximately 8 years. She had managed the gap through refinancing arrangements that were approaching the limit of their usefulness. She needed a significant sum to restructure her position. She was looking when David made contact. He did this through a corporate structure with several layers of legal separation. Entirely legitimate, entirely documented. The kind of structure that looks like a private lending vehicle when you look at it directly and looks like something else entirely when you follow it to its source. The loan terms were high but legal. The interest schedule was documented and complex and they did not read it carefully. The collateral was the Whitmore property. The house and the vehicles and the personal assets that constituted the visible evidence of 30 years of social position. She and Julian signed in October. Julian co-signed because the property was jointly held. The lending vehicle was wholly owned by the Arthur Bennett Foundation. The Arthur Bennett Foundation had one beneficiary. Everything they had put up as collateral was, on the 61st day after signing, mine. David sent me a photograph of the signed documents that afternoon. I was reviewing table arrangements for a fall gala. I looked at the photograph. I thought about my father at his kitchen table on Sunday mornings with the radio on. I thought about the phrase he used when something was done well, which was "that's well done." said simply, without additional emphasis. I put my phone in my pocket and I went back to the tables. The hearing was on a December morning. The courtroom was high-ceilinged and cold in the way of public buildings where the heat is always slightly insufficient. I arrived with David. Evelyn and Julian arrived with their attorney, a man named Carver who had a reputation and who had been selected because Evelyn believed she needed aggression. Evelyn said something to me in the hallway before we entered. She said I was going to leave this courtroom with nothing and go back to wherever I had come from. She said it pleasantly, the way she said everything she was certain about. I said I hoped the hearing went well for everyone. She looked at me with the assessment she had always used and she went in. David opened his briefcase at the right moment. He presented the documents in the order he had organized them. The trust documentation and its conditions. The divorce filing and how it satisfied the first condition. The cloud backup materials, properly authenticated through discovery, and how they satisfied the second condition. The loan agreement and its collateral provisions. The default timeline and when the collateral provisions had triggered. He explained that the lending vehicle was wholly owned by the Audrey Bennett Foundation. He explained that the Audrey Bennett Foundation had one beneficiary. He said my name. Carver objected several times. The objections were overruled. The judge examined the documentation carefully. She asked David clarifying questions. He answered both. She said she needed 10 days to review. We walked out. David held the door. In the hallway, Evelyn was speaking to Carver in a raised voice. I heard my name once. I did not slow down. The ruling came on a Thursday. David called at 9 in the morning. He read me the numbers carefully. The collateral provisions upheld. The trust conditions satisfied on both grounds. The assets transferred. I said thank you. He said your father built something solid and you executed it exactly as he would have wanted. I said I thought so too. He said there was one more thing. He said when the trust documents were finalized my father had said something to pass along if everything went as planned. He said to tell her I always knew she was capable of it. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said thank you for telling me. He said of course. He said there was a great deal of work ahead and he would be there for all of it. I said I was counting on it. The Whitmore property sold 6 weeks later. I divided the proceeds between 3 organizations. One provided housing assistance to families in sudden financial crisis. One funded legal aid for people who could not afford civil representation. One supported children who had lost parents. I chose those 3 specifically. My father would have found them appropriate. Julian came to my apartment in January. He stood in the doorway. He said he was sorry, simply, without explanation. I said I heard you. I said I wished him well. Then I closed the door. I stood for a moment with my hand on the door. I thought about the boxes on the porch. I thought about the black dress and the 40-minute drive and the locked door. I thought about Julian's eyes on the floor of my grandfather's house on the afternoon of my father's funeral. Then I made dinner. I sat at the small kitchen table. I ate. I want to tell you about the months that followed because the months that followed are not a postscript. They are where the real work was. The Audrey Bennett Foundation needed a structure, not a legal structure. David was handling that with the precision he brought to everything. The character of it, what it stood for, what my father had built it to do and what I was going to build inside it. I had been thinking about this since October when I sat at the small kitchen table in the East Side apartment and wrote in the notebook about what the proceeds of the Whitmore sale should mean. I had written down 3 categories before I had the proceeds. I knew what I wanted the money to do before I had it. That was, David said later, one of the most characteristic things I could have done. He said my father had noted it specifically. He said my father had told him that Audrey always knew what a thing was for before she had it. He said he thought that was the quality that made her good at the work she did and that would make her good at the work she was going to do. I said I had learned it from my father. He said I know. He said that was what he was telling me. We met weekly through the winter and into the spring. The meetings were professional and they were also becoming something else. The way meetings become something else when 2 people are genuinely interested in the same problems and have compatible ways of thinking about them. He brought his thoughts organized and specific. I brought mine the same way. We disagreed on specific points sometimes and the disagreements were productive rather than depleting. He asked me once, in February, what my father had been like, not as a legal subject, as a person. I told him about the coffee and the Sunday mornings and the radio and the notebook and the phrase he used when something was done well. I told him about the tilted head and the narrowed eyes when he was assessing something. I told him about the patience. David listened in the way he always listened, completely, not preparing what he was going to say while I was still talking. Then he said, "Your father sounds like someone who understood that the most important things were usually quiet." I said yes. I said that was exactly right. He said, "I can see that in you." I said I was working on it. He said, "You're further along than you know." I want to tell you about the cemetery because I go to the cemetery on the first Saturday of every month and the going has become its own kind of conversation. I sit on a bench by the path. I tell him what is happening. The foundation and the partnerships and the specific work of figuring out how to use what he built well. I told him about the arts education partnership, the 17 children who played 3 pieces at a fall gala and received a standing ovation, and the way that ovation had stayed with me as an image of what the work was for. I told him about David, not the legal work, the person, the quality of attention he brought to things. The way he remembered the specific details from previous conversations and built on them rather than starting fresh. The dog named Edgar who was 11 years old and opinionated. The parents in Asheville who cared about their garden more than he had expected. I told him I was going to move back into his house, not to go backward, to go forward from a place I understood. The kitchen table and the east-facing window and the morning light that had been the same morning light since my grandfather had oriented the house on the lot 60 years ago. I wanted to build the next thing from there the way he had built his things from there. I wanted to sit at that table in the mornings and work from the place he had worked from. I think he was glad about this. I cannot know that for certain. What I know is that when I made the decision and sat with it for a day and then told David about it and saw his face when I told him, the decision felt accurate. Accurate in the way my father used accuracy, not as a measurement, as a form of recognition. The situation finally matching what was actually there. David and I had dinner in February. He had asked in January and I had said give me a month and he had given me exactly a month. We went to a restaurant on the west side. We ordered food and ate it slowly and talked about things that were not the case or the foundation. He told me about Ohio and his brother who was a physician and the parents who gardened more than expected. I told him about my father's workshop and the specific smell of it, wood and machine oil, and the Sunday mornings and the radio, and the patient quality my father had brought to dying the same way he had brought it to everything. He said my father sounded like a man who had understood what mattered. I said yes. He said he could see what mattered to me too. I said I was still figuring it out. He said I know. He said that was one of the things he found most interesting to watch. We stayed until the restaurant closed. On the way out he said there was a lot of work ahead and he would like to be part of all of it, the professional work and the other work of figuring out what the next period looked like. He said he thought we were good at talking to each other and that seemed worth not letting go of. I said that seemed worth not letting go of to me too. We walked out into the February cold. The street was lit with the particular clarity that belongs to winter, bare branches and cold air and the specific light that the season makes. He walked next to me. At the corner he said goodnight. I said goodnight. I drove home. I parked in front of the East Side apartment and I sat in the car for a moment and I thought about my father. I thought about the 8 months he had spent building something while he was dying. The trust and the conditions and the name he had chosen for it, his own father's name, the connection across 3 generations built into a single legal structure. The love in the precision as love. I thought about what he had asked David to tell me. That he had always known I was capable of it, not hoped, known. I got out of the car. I went upstairs. I made tea. I sat at the small kitchen table one more time and I opened the notebook and I wrote down what I was thinking, which was that the next thing was going to be good, and that I was going to build it carefully, and that I was not going to do it alone. My father built something for me before he left. I found it. I honored it. I am going to keep honoring it. My name is Audrey Bennett. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. I want to tell you about my father before anything else because the trust and the conditions and the 40 to million are not the story. They are the instrument. The story is the man who built the instrument while he was dying and who did it so carefully that it worked exactly as he intended. My father's name was Arthur Bennett. He had been named for his grandfather and he carried the name without making a point of it. He was a real estate developer in Charlotte for 25 years. Not the kind who put his name on buildings or appeared in profiles. The kind who built things that worked and who took the long view of what working meant. He grew up in the house that would later become the house I am going to move back into. His father had built it in the early 60s, oriented it specifically for the morning light, and my father had grown up in that light and had never quite lost the sense that morning light in a kitchen was one of the measures of whether a place was right. He bought 3 other houses before he came back to that one. He lived in it for 30 years. He was not a demonstrative man. He expressed what he felt through precision and attention and the specific quality of care that builds things rather than performs them. He asked me what I thought, not what I wanted, what I thought. He asked and then he waited for the real answer. He did not prepare what he was going to say while I was still talking. I learned everything important from that practice. The distinction between what you think and what you are supposed to think. The patience for the real answer. The understanding that waiting for the real answer was itself a form of respect. He had been watching Julian for 2 years before he died. He had watched and he had reached conclusions and he had made decisions based on those conclusions. He did not tell me the conclusions because telling me would have changed the quality of the time we had left. He wanted me to be his daughter in those last months. He handled the other thing himself. When David told me what he had done, I sat in the office for a long time. Not processing the legal structure, processing the love in it. The fact that a man who was dying had spent 8 months building a safety net for his daughter so she would not know she needed it until she needed it. The fact that he had trusted David completely and David had not said a word. That was what I was sitting with, not the 40 to million, the 8 months. There was a moment in the fall that I have not told you about. It was a Saturday in September, 5 weeks after the funeral, 3 weeks after I had moved into the East Side apartment. I had been working all week and the work had been good in the specific way that necessary work is good. It fills the hours and requires enough attention that the other things wait. But on that Saturday I had no work and I woke up early and I could not go back to sleep and I lay in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar apartment and I thought about my father. I thought about him specifically, not abstractly. The specific man in the specific house on Sunday mornings. I thought about the last visit before he died when we had sat in the kitchen after dinner and talked about things that were not his illness or my marriage or anything that required careful handling. We had talked about a book he was reading about the history of urban development in American cities and he had opinions about it and I had questions about his opinions and we had been in the conversation for 2 hours before either of us noticed how late it was. That was the conversation I was thinking about. 2 hours about urban development. The specific pleasure of my father having opinions and me having questions about them. I got up. I made coffee. I sat at the small kitchen table and I opened the notebook and I wrote down everything I could remember of that conversation, the arguments he had made and the examples he had used and the way his face looked when he was making a point he found particularly important, which was the tilted head and the narrowed eyes that I had learned to recognize as the indicator that something worth writing down was coming. I wrote for an hour. When I was done, I had 6 pages. I looked at the 6 pages and I thought that was the right thing to have done with the morning. Then I got dressed and I went to work on the logistics for the Children's Hospital fundraiser. I have been writing down what I remember of my father since then, not every day. When something surfaces that is worth keeping. The notebook from that year is thicker than most of the others. He deserved the thickness. I want to tell you about Patricia, my aunt, my father's sister. She came to Charlotte in November, 6 weeks after the funeral, and she stayed for 3 days and we walked by the river and we ate at a restaurant near the water and she asked me how I was actually doing, not as a formula, as a question. I told her as much of the truth as I could tell. She listened in the way she had always listened, which was the way her brother listened, with full attention and without the performance of it. She was 61 years old and she had her brother's quality of paying attention without announcing herself. She said, "Your father knew what he was doing." I said, "I know." She said, "He always knew what he was doing." I said, "Yes." She said, "He worried about you for years and I always told him you were going to be fine and he said he knew you were going to be fine and then he made sure of it anyway. That was his way, making sure." I said it was the best thing about him. She said yes. She said it was the thing I was most like him in. I said I hoped so. She said, "I know you do." She said, "You've always hoped to be like him and you've always been more like him than you knew." She went home on a Sunday morning. She hugged me at the door and she said, "Call me when it's done." I said I would. She said, "I know you will." I watched her car until I could not see it anymore. Then I went inside and I made tea and I sat at the small kitchen table and I wrote in the notebook about what Patricia had said, that I was more like him than I knew. I have thought about that many times since. whether it is true, whether the way I handled the months that followed is evidence of it. I think it might be. Not the specific legal strategy, that was David's intelligence as much as mine. The pace of it, the silence, the decision to let the situation develop at its own rate rather than rushing toward the outcome. The understanding that patience was not passivity but its own form of action. He had been patient about dying. I had been patient about the months after. Maybe that was the same quality expressing itself in different circumstances. He would not have said so. He would have said that's well done and meant it without elaboration. I want to tell you about what happened with the foundation in the spring because the foundation is the thing I am most proud of and I want to give it the account it deserves. We formalized the board structure in March. David was the first board member I asked. He said yes without hesitation. I asked Patricia. She said yes. I asked the director of the arts education organization we had been discussing since January. She said yes, and then she said something I have held since. She said she had been waiting for someone who understood that arts education was not supplemental. She said in her experience people came to it as something extra and she wanted to work with someone who understood it was structural. I said I understood that completely. She said she could see that. She said she was glad I had called. The first partnership funded music programs in 11 schools, instruments and instruction for students who had no access to either. The student orchestra performed at a fundraising gala in the fall. 17 students between 11 and 15. They played 3 pieces and the room gave them a standing ovation that lasted longer than necessary and that the students received with the specific combination of pride and disbelief that belongs to young people who have just done something they did not know they could do. I was at the back of the room watching the ovation. I thought about my father and his belief in the practical investment in children's capacity, the knowledge of what well done felt like. He had said once that the most important thing you could give a child was the experience of mastering something real, not the praise for it but the mastery itself. He said you could tell when a child had experienced that because something changed in how they held themselves. I watched the students receiving the ovation and something had changed in how they held themselves. I wrote about it later in the notebook. I wrote that Dad would have found this exactly right. The house. My grandfather oriented it for the morning light. The kitchen faces east and from the window above the sink you can see the backyard and in the mornings the light comes through and changes the color of everything it touches. I have been standing in that kitchen light my whole life and I have been away from it for almost a year and I am going to go back to it. This is not about the past. I am 25 years old and I do not need to go back to anything. What I need is to build the next thing from a place I understand, and that house is a place I understand more deeply than any other. The structure of it, the way the light moves through it at different hours, the specific sound the stairs make, the workshop smell from the back of the garage where my father's tools are still hung in the organization he developed over 30 years. I am going to live in it. I am going to maintain it the way he maintained it. I am going to add to the files in the cabinet where he documented everything, the repairs and the updates and the notes about why specific decisions were made. My handwriting is different from his. The format will be the same because it is a good format. I told David about this decision on a Friday evening over dinner. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. Then he said, "That's the right thing." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because you said it the way you say things you've thought through completely." He said, "I've learned that when you've thought something through completely, it looks like that." I said, "My father was like that." He said, "Yes." He said he knew. He said he had seen it in the trust documents the first time he read them, the specific completeness of a decision that had been thought through to its end. He said he recognized it in me from the first week in his office. I said that was a generous thing to say. He said it was an accurate thing to say. He said there was a difference. I said I know. I said my father always made that distinction. He said he knew. He said that was where I had learned it. We walked out into the spring evening after dinner. Charlotte in April is specific in the way of places that have earned their seasons. The trees were in full leaf and the air was warm without being heavy and the streets were lit with the kind of evening light that makes a city look like an argument for staying in it. He walked next to me for a block and then we stopped at the corner where we always stopped when we walked this way. He said good night. I said good night. Then he said one more thing. He said your father would have been proud of this year. Not the money or the outcome. The year. The way you were in it. I held that for a moment. Then I said thank you. He said of course. He said good night again and I said good night again and I drove home. I sat in the car in front of the East Side apartment for the last time. In a week, I would be in my grandfather's house. The morning light would be there when I woke up. The kitchen table would be there. The filing cabinet would be there with my father's records and room in it for mine. He had built something for me. I had found it. I had used it the way he had built it to be used. I was going to keep building. My name is Audrey Bennett. My father saw me accurately and loved me with that accuracy. I am going to keep earning it. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. I want to tell you about the event in September, not because it is a turning point, because it was the day I understood what the work actually was. The Children's Hospital fundraiser had been on my calendar since before my father died. I had agreed to coordinate it in the spring, when the date was 6 months away and the spring had the quality of a time when 6 months feels manageable. Then my father died in the summer and the months between collapsed and it was September and I was setting up for the fundraiser in the East Side Apartments closest analog to a life. The event was at a venue I had used before, ballroom capacity for 300, a silent auction, a live component featuring a physician who had made a significant breakthrough in pediatric oncology the previous year and who was going to speak about the work. I had organized the seating and the catering and the audio-visual and the volunteer coordination and the day of logistics. I arrived at 6 in the morning. The venue was empty and the tables were bare and the space had the particular quality of early morning venues, all potential and no event yet. I began the setup. By 9 the tables were dressed. By 11 the audio-visual was checked. By noon the volunteers had arrived and been briefed and deployed. By 6 the guests were arriving and the room was what it was supposed to be. The physician spoke at 8. She was 53 years old and she had been working on her specific area of research for 11 years. She spoke for 20 minutes about what the research had produced and what it meant for children with specific diagnoses and what the funding from events like this one made possible. She was not a natural public speaker. She was a precise speaker. She said what was true and moved to the next true thing without decoration. I was at the back of the room. I had been at the back of the room for 15 years of events, watching to make sure everything was working. I watched the room receive the physician's speech. I watched people lean forward. I watched the quality of attention shift from the polite attention of people who have paid to attend an event to the real attention of people who are being told something that matters. She said at one point that the difference between a treatment that worked and a treatment that worked for every child was a question of resources. She said resources were time and money and both of those things were in the room. She said what happened in rooms like this one was not separate from what happened in laboratories. She said they were the same work. I thought about my father, about what he had said about the difference between making something work and making something work for everyone. He had said that in the context of his development work, the difference between a building that served some people and a building that served all the people it was supposed to serve. He had said that distinction was where most of the real work lived. The physician was making the same argument, the same distinction, the same insistence that the work was not finished when it mostly worked. I thought about what the Audrey Bennett Foundation was going to do. I thought about it specifically for the first time as a coherent whole rather than as a set of separate decisions. The arts education and the legal aid and the support for children who had lost parents and the other things that were not decided yet. I thought about the common thread. The common thread was access. The difference between things that worked for some people and things that worked for everyone. The specific gap between what existed and what was needed for the gap to close. I stood at the back of the room and I understood what my father had built. Not just the trust. The trust was the instrument. What he had built was an opportunity. He had built the opportunity and trusted me to understand what it was for. He had trusted me to arrive at the common thread. I had arrived. It had taken until September and a pediatric oncologist giving a 22-minute speech about the gap between what worked and what worked for everyone. But I had arrived. That's well done. I heard it in my father's voice with his specific tone. I wrote it in the notebook when I got home that night. I want to tell you about the last 6 months of my father's life in more detail than I have given them, because those months are usually described as the decline and the decline misses most of what was actually happening. Yes, he was declining. The body was doing what bodies do when they are leaving. He was less present physically in the later months, more tired, moving more slowly, with the specific economy of someone who is rationing energy. But his mind was not declining. His mind was doing what it had always done, which was thinking carefully about what needed to be done and then doing it. He was running the trust project in those months. He was meeting with David. He was reading documents and asking questions and making decisions. He was building something with the same precision he had always brought to building things, only now with the additional constraint of a timeline he could feel. He did not tell me about any of it. I visited on weekends and we had dinner and we talked about the things we talked about, and he did not say anything about the 40 to million or the trust or the conditions. He asked me about work. He asked about specific events I was working on. He asked follow-up questions that showed he had been listening the last time. He was present for me completely in those months. The other work he kept in a separate room. I have thought about this a great deal since. About what it cost him to keep those two things separate, to be fully present in the dinners and the conversations while simultaneously running a parallel project that was about what came after the dinners and the conversations ended. I think it cost him something. I think it was one of the hardest things he did, which means it was very hard, because he was not someone who made easy things difficult. He did it because he wanted the remaining time to be the remaining time, not preparation. Not anticipation, the thing itself, the dinners and the conversations and the radio on Sunday mornings and the tilted head and the narrowed eyes, and that's well done. He gave me the time and he handled the rest himself. That was the gift, the real gift. The 40 to million was the consequence of the gift. The gift was the 8 months he gave me to be just his daughter without knowing what was coming. David asked me once in the late winter what I thought my father would make of this year if he could see it. We were at the office for a foundation meeting and the formal part of the meeting was done and we were finishing the last of the coffee and I was writing something down and he asked the question without preamble. I thought about it. I thought about the specific categories, the legal outcome and the trust and the Whitmore situation, the foundation and the partnerships and what was being built, the way I had handled the months between the funeral and the ruling, the dinner in February and the walks and the Friday evenings. I said I think he would have found most of it well done. I said I think he would have had specific notes on the legal strategy that would have been useful. I said I think he would have had strong opinions about the foundation's approach to measuring outcomes that would have improved the approach. I said I think he would have been satisfied with the property decisions. David nodded. He said, what about the other things? I said, what other things? He said the things that were not the foundation or the legal outcome. I said I thought he would have been glad about those. I said he had told David specifically that he thought we would have reasons to keep talking. He said he thought my father had been right. I said I thought so too. Then he said one more thing. He said your father told me once that the thing he was most afraid of was that the time would run out before he had made sure you were going to be okay. He said he wanted me to know that he had made sure. He said he spent the 8 months making sure and he believed he had done it. I held that for a moment. Then I said he did. He said yes. He said very well done. I heard my father's voice in that. Very well done. The slight upgrade from the standard well done. Reserved for things that genuinely exceeded the expected. I wrote it in the notebook that evening. I wrote what David had said and what I had heard in it. Then I wrote thank you, Dad. Then I closed the notebook. It is July. The foundation is 7 months old. The first partnership is in its 2nd year. The legal aid partnership begins in September. There are 2 more conversations underway about things that are not decided yet. David is on the board and he is good on the board in the way he is good at everything, prepared and specific and genuinely interested in what the work is for rather than just in the mechanics of it. We have dinner on most Fridays. We have stopped calling them anything because they do not need a name. They are what they are. My grandfather's house is mine. I move in next month. I have been going out on weekends to prepare it, the practical work of getting a house ready for someone to live in it. I cleaned the workshop and I inventoried my father's tools and I added the first entry to the filing cabinet in my handwriting. I noted what I had done and why. I noted the date. I noted what would need attention next. My handwriting is different from his. The format is the same. The morning light in the kitchen is exactly what it has always been. East-facing. Present every morning that the sky cooperates. My grandfather chose the orientation and my father maintained it and I am going to maintain it. That is the chain. That is what inheritance is when it is done with full attention to what matters. My father died on a Monday and built something for me to find. I found it. I used it. I am building on it. He said I was always capable of it. He was right. He was right about most things and he was right about that most of all. My name is Audrey Bennett. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. The notebook matters more than I have said. I have kept notebooks since I was 12 years old. My father gave me the first one. He said, write down what you actually notice, not what you think you are supposed to notice, and your real thinking lives in the difference between those two things. I have followed that instruction for 13 years across more notebooks than I have counted. The notebook from the year my father died is the one I look at when I need to remember that year accurately. Not the version of the year that I have told people, the actual year, the texture of it. The handwriting changes significantly between the entries from the 2 weeks after his death and the entries from October when I was working through the documentation. Earlier entries, letters uneven, pressed harder into the page, sentences that end mid-thought and do not pick up again. October entries, organized, structured, with the specific clarity of someone who has a problem with specific dimensions and is working through those dimensions in order. Both sets of entries are true. The grief and the clarity were not separate. The clarity was made of the grief in the specific way that urgent things sometimes are. I wrote about Julian in November, not with anger, which surprised me when I read it later, with something more like the specific feeling of having understood something that had been unclear. I wrote that I thought Julian had never been able to see people clearly because he had never needed to. He had always been presented with people who were performing for him, his mother first and then his friends and then eventually me, and he had learned to read the performances rather than the people. He did not know how to read the actual person because he had never needed to develop that capacity. This was not a generous account of Julian. It was an accurate one. I had been performing for Julian for 3 years in the way of a person who has internalized someone else's requirements and is meeting them without fully registering that she is doing so. I had been smaller than myself in those years, not dramatically. In the specific way that accumulates slowly enough that you do not notice the accumulation until you have the notebook from 8 years ago and you compare it to the notebook from the year just past and you can see the difference clearly. The notebook from 8 years ago is louder. That is the word, louder. The observations are bigger. The language has more reach. The entries are longer and they go somewhere. The notebook from the 3 years of being Julian's wife is quieter in a way that I now understand was not peace but reduction. The notebook from the year of the trust is loud again. It is the loudest notebook since I was 20 and in the middle of a period of my life that felt genuinely full. I am glad to have it back. I intend to keep it. I want to tell you about the Wednesday evening in October when I sat with the documentation from Julian's cloud backup. I have described what I found. I want to describe what it was like to sit with it, not emotionally, physically, the apartment, the quality of the evening, the specific experience of that particular hour. It was October and Charlotte in October is doing the thing it does, beginning to let go of summer without committing to fall. The evenings cooler but not cold, the trees starting to consider the change. I was at the kitchen table. I had made tea that had gone cold because I had forgotten to drink it. The laptop was open and I was reading things I had not expected to read. I read everything once. Then I closed the laptop. Then I opened it and I read everything again more slowly. Then I closed it again and I sat for a while with my hands flat on the table. What I was thinking about was not Julian. What I was thinking about was my father. I was thinking about the fact that he had known, not specifically about the messages, but the direction of what was there. The character of the people I was married to and connected to. He had known the direction and he had built accordingly. He had been right. He had been completely right. The trust and the conditions were built for exactly this. The conditions existed because he had understood exactly this kind of documentation would exist and would need to be used. I sat with my hands flat on the table and I thought about my father knowing this for a year before he died. About carrying that knowledge and not telling me and building the structure instead. About the patience that required, the love that required, the specific form of love that builds a safety net instead of a warning because a warning would have changed the time remaining. I sat for a long time. Then I made fresh tea. Then I emailed David and I said I have what we need and he wrote back within 2 minutes and said I know you do. I want to tell you about what David said to me in the fall when we were deep in the work of building the foundation structure. He said, your father understood that protecting someone is not the same as telling them what to do. He said most people who want to protect the people they love make the mistake of replacing the person's decisions with their own. He said your father did the opposite. He said he built something that would come into play only after you had made your own decision, whatever that decision turned out to be. He said the trust activated on your choice, not on his. I had not thought about it in those terms. I thought about it after David said it, and I thought he was right. The conditions were filed for divorce or infidelity documented. Both of those conditions preserved my agency. The trust did not activate because my father had decided the marriage was wrong. It activated because I decided, or because Julian's actions forced the decision. My father had made himself present in the outcome without making himself present in the decision. That was the most precise thing anyone had ever done for me. The most precise form of love. Not directing, not deciding. Building a structure that would support whatever I chose and be there when I needed it. David said your father understood the difference between care and control. He said that's a rare understanding. He said most people confuse the two. I said he had always known the difference. I said that was one of the things I had been most grateful for my whole life, that he cared about what I thought rather than what I should think, that he built things for me rather than telling me what to do. David said yes. He said I can see that. He said it shows in everything you've done this year. I wrote that down in the notebook later. Not the compliment, the observation about my father. The difference between care and control, the trust as an expression of that difference. It's the most true thing anyone said about him all year. There is one more thing I want to say before I close the account. On the night before the hearing, I did not sleep well. Not because I was afraid of the outcome. I trusted the documentation, and I trusted David, and I trusted the structure my father had built. What kept me from sleeping was something else. I lay in the dark in the East Side apartment, and I thought about the boxes on the porch. I had not thought about them in months. I had moved past them into the work of the months that followed, and the boxes had receded. That night they came back, not as a source of pain, as a source of something more specific. I was thinking about the dish towel, the person who had wrapped the anniversary photograph in a dish towel before packing it into the box. I had never found out who had done that. Julian or someone he had hired. Someone had taken the time to wrap that photograph in a dish towel, and I had thought about that many times without resolving who it was. I thought that night that it might have been Julian, that somewhere inside him there had been enough awareness of what the photograph meant to wrap it carefully before putting it in the box. That the careless and calculated person who had planned those months alongside my closest friend had also wrapped my parents' anniversary photograph in a dish towel. This did not change anything about what had happened or what was going to happen. It was just a true thing. The person who had wrapped the photograph was the same person who had looked at the floor of my grandfather's house on the day of my father's funeral. Both things were true. People are the combination of both things. Julian was both things, and so was Evelyn, and so was my former friend, and so was everyone I had known who had not been what I had believed them to be. I thought about my father. My father had always known people were both things. He had not been surprised by complexity. He had been precise about it instead. I fell asleep thinking about the dish towel. In the morning I got up and I put on the good suit and I drove to meet David at the courthouse. We walked in together. The rest happened the way I have told you. My name is Audrey Bennett. My father died and left me something real. I found it. I used it. I am building on it. He wrapped the things that mattered in dish towels. He oriented the house for the morning light. He spent his dying months building a safety net and did not tell me because he wanted the remaining time to be the remaining time. That is who he was. That is what he left me. Not the 40 to million. The example. I am going to keep following it. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. Spring came the way spring comes in Charlotte, slowly and then suddenly. The trees in full leaf before you have registered the change happening. I was moving into my grandfather's house in May, and the house was surrounded by the specific green of a Charlotte May, dense and insistent, the kind of green that has been building all winter and is finally doing what it intended. The move was not complicated. I had not accumulated much in the East Side apartment. Deliberately, I had understood from the beginning that the apartment was temporary, and I had not put things in it that were meant to be permanent. The notebook shelf, the clothes, the small things that were specifically mine. Everything fit in the car and one trip with a borrowed truck that David drove because he insisted on being there for the day. We carried boxes into the house. Not many boxes. It did not take long. When the truck was empty, we sat on the back porch. My grandfather's back porch that my father had maintained and that I was going to maintain, and we drank water because it was warm and David had thought to bring it. He said, "How does it feel?" I said, "It feels right in a way I did not expect to feel this fast." He said, "Your father would have called that useful information." I said yes. He said he would have found it meaningful, that it felt right immediately. I said yes. He said he would have made a note of it. I said I was going to make a note of it. I went inside and I wrote in the notebook, the back porch, May afternoon. It feels right immediately. I came back outside. David was looking at the backyard, the garden my father had maintained, the things planted in the right places for the right reasons. He said, I can see him in this yard. I said yes. He said, it's a good yard. I said yes. He said, you're going to keep it like this. It was not a question. I said yes. We sat for another hour. The afternoon did what afternoons do in May in Charlotte, warm and long and not in a hurry. I thought about my father sitting on this porch. I thought about how many times he had sat here and looked at this yard and thought about whatever he was thinking about. I thought about the notebook entries he had not kept, the things he had observed and not written down, the version of his thinking I would never have access to. I thought about what I did have access to, the house, the filing cabinet, the specific knowledge of who he was that had been built over 25 years of his particular way of paying attention to me. The trust and the conditions and the 40 to million were expressions of that knowledge. The morning light was an expression of that knowledge. The dish towel was an expression of that knowledge. He knew me. He built for who I was. I am going to keep being who I was. David said, are you thinking about your father? I said yes. He said good. He said that seemed right for today. I said yes. We sat until the evening light changed. Then we went inside and I made dinner in my grandfather's kitchen, in the kitchen where the radio had been on Sunday mornings, at the stove my father had cooked at for 30 years. The kitchen light was the afternoon light, which was different from the morning light but was also good in its own way. David sat at the kitchen table and watched me cook, and we talked, and the conversation was easy in the way that things are easy when they have been building toward being easy for long enough. He asked good questions. I gave real answers. We arrived somewhere by the end of dinner that we had not been at the beginning. After dinner we sat at the kitchen table with tea. He said, I think your father would have found this evening well done. I said, more than well done. He said yes. He said, probably very well done. I said yes. I said very well done was the high category. He said reserved for things that genuinely exceeded the expected. I said yes. He said this exceeds what I expected. I said what had he expected? He said he had expected a good outcome. He said he had not expected this specific evening at this specific table in this specific kitchen to feel the way it felt. I said, what way did it feel? He said, like the thing it was supposed to be. I thought about that. Then I said my father would have approved of that description. He said, I know. He said, I've been paying attention to what your father would have approved of since January. He said it's a reliable guide. I laughed. It was a small laugh but a real one. He looked at me and he smiled, and the evening was what it was, and the kitchen was the kitchen, and the morning light was waiting for the next morning. The next morning I was up at 6, the east-facing kitchen window. The light coming in exactly the way my grandfather had intended it to come in 60 years ago. I stood at the window with coffee and I looked at the backyard in the morning light, and I thought about the chain. My grandfather oriented the house for the morning light. My father lived in the light his whole life and understood it as one of the measures of whether a place was right. I am standing in the light now and it is exactly right, and I am 25 years old and I have the rest of my life to stand in it. That is the inheritance, not the 40 to million. Though the 40 to million made it possible to do what I am going to do with the rest of my life without the specific constraint of having to do other things first. The inheritance is the morning light and the understanding of why the morning light matters, and the knowledge that a person who loves you will orient things to give you access to it. I am going to orient things for the people I am trying to help. I am going to build the foundation so that the work is oriented correctly, toward access and closing the gap and making the things that work for some people work for everyone. I am going to pay attention to what is actually there and build for what is actually there. My father did that. I am going to do that. I finished the coffee. I rinsed the cup. I went to the workshop in the back of the garage and I stood in the specific smell of it, wood and machine oil, and the smell of my father's work. And I looked at the tools hung on the north wall in the organization he had developed over 30 years. I knew where everything was. I had learned the organization by watching. I could navigate it in the dark. That is what he gave me. not just the things, the knowledge of the things, the understanding of the organization behind the things, the 30 years of accumulated understanding that he had passed to me through proximity and attention and the specific way of showing up that teaches without announcing itself. I stood in the workshop for a few minutes. Then I went back to the kitchen. I made more coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the east window, and I opened the notebook and I wrote the first entry from the house. May morning. Morning light correct. Workshop organized. Kitchen table. This is the right place. Then I wrote thank you, Dad. Then I went to work. My name is Audrey Bennett. The morning light is exactly right. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. 6 months into living in the house, I want to tell you what I have learned about what it means to live in a place that was built for you. Not built for you personally. Built for the person my grandfather hoped would come after him. The house was built for the idea of a family that would use the morning light the way morning light is meant to be used, as the beginning of days rather than something that happens while you are already doing something else. I use it as a beginning. I am up before 6 most mornings. The kitchen first. Coffee. The window. The yard. The specific quality of the early light that my grandfather understood when he oriented the house and that I now understand in the specific way of someone who has stood in it for 6 months through 3 seasons. Spring light is different from summer light. Summer light comes in at a lower angle in the mornings, the sun still rising, and it is warmer and more horizontal, and it illuminates the side of things rather than the top. Fall light is cooler and more direct. I have been learning this the way you learn things that are available to you every day, incrementally and without effort, the way my father must have learned it over 30 years. He knew this light. He knew its seasonal variations and its quality at different hours and what it did to the color of the kitchen walls and the table and the surfaces of things. He had been observing it his whole life. I am in the first year of observing it and I am already learning things about it. This is how I know I made the right decision. The rightness shows up in small ways every morning. The light, the workshop smell that comes through when I open the garage door. The particular sound the kitchen door makes when it closes, a sound I have known my whole life that I did not know I had memorized until I heard it again from the inside. I am adding things to the filing cabinet. The foundation board meeting notes. The partnership documents for the arts education program. The initial documents for the legal aid partnership. The notes from the site visit to the first of the supported schools where I watched children who had not had access to instruments hold them for the first time. My handwriting is different from my father's. I have noticed this is a comfort rather than a problem. My entries add to his rather than trying to reproduce them. The filing cabinet holds both of us now, his 30 years and my first year, and the 2 sets of entries are in conversation in the way of things that belong to the same tradition expressed through different hands. He would have said that's well done. I am trying to earn it every day. David and I talked last week about what comes next for the foundation. Not the logistics. Those are handled. The character. What the next 3 years should build toward. He said he thought the common thread was access and that access was a word I use precisely and I should keep using it precisely because imprecise use of the word made the work sound like it was about more than it was, which made it sound like it was about less. I said I agreed. I said access was specific and specific was better than expansive when it came to doing work that actually changed things. He said my father had said something similar to him once. He said my father had said that the most common failure mode in charitable work was the mistake of trying to do everything when you could do one specific thing well. He said my father had said that the history of institutions that lasted was the history of institutions that knew what they were for and kept being that. I said that sounded like him. He said yes. He said it was one of the things he thought about most when he thought about the foundation structure and what made a structure durable versus what made it impressive. I said what was the difference? He said impressive structures attracted attention and durable structures survived it. I said my father would have called that accurate. He said I know. He said that's why I said it. I wrote it down later. Impressive structures attract attention. Durable structures survive it. Then I wrote, build the durable one. That is what I am doing. That is what I intend to keep doing. Not the impressive version of what the foundation could be. The durable version. The one that knows what it is for and keeps being that. My father built a durable structure. I am building on it. I am 25 years old and I have morning light and a filing cabinet and a workshop and a board that meets monthly and partnerships that are doing real work and David on most Friday evenings and the notebook where I write what I actually notice. I have everything I need. I have more than I need. I have more than I expected. He knew. He always knew I was capable of it. He built accordingly. My name is Audrey Bennett. The morning light is exactly right. The work is exactly right. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it.